Are you on my stream? Okay, I'm on. Can you hear me? You can hear me? And see me? Okay. Wait, because I can't hear you on the phone. Is it your volume just really low? Oh, there it is. Okay. So we'll see. Hey, how's it going, everybody? I just started a few minutes early to make sure everything was in order. You guys can hear me and see me okay? Nice. So how's everybody doing? Everybody doing good? So we got a few people here already. Huh? Paper's not that. Yeah, it's pretty warm. I mean, Kingston's not too bad right now. Last week it was really bad. Now it's pretty nice. So it's not too bad right now, but it's warm. Yeah, I just loaded it up. We got 10 people here right now according to my my dashboard here, which is pretty good considering we haven't started yet. And then once we'll start around 8, I'll probably just talk a little bit about, the state of the channel, things like that. And then just kind of open it up for questions and see where people are at with that. Brianna, my wife, is going to be helping. She's going to help read some questions and whatnot, because it's hard for me to look at the screen here and then focus in on my camera to talk with you guys kind of face to face. So it means I'll be doing less of that, at least as long as Brianna is able to stay and help with that. So that should make for a smoother experience. It'll also mean I'll probably be less likely to miss your guys' questions because I don't have to be looking away from the dashboard as you guys are typing to answer a question that I've gotten already, right? So if that makes any sense. Oh, from NorCal. That's cool. Yeah, I mean, I have a kind of divided audience. I'd say most of my subscribers are Canadian. Looking at my data, I think about 2/3 are Canadian and about 1/3 is American. There's a few people from Europe and what have you, but pretty much everyone's Canadian or American. So that's why I try to make content for both Canadian and American audiences, because the Canadian audience is the majority of my subscriber base, but the American audience in general is just so much bigger, and in a way that most Americans aren't. Canadians are interested in American politics too, because it affects us so much, right? So, I mean, for Americans who don't know, I mean, some Canadians pay more attention to your elections than our own. I mean, the U.S. election is tier 1 news here as well. Every bit as important in some ways, at least from media coverage, as our own election. No.
Oh, that's a surprise, Susan says.
Yeah. So I mean, if you don't know the context, it's hard to get a sense, right? But it's really the case that a Canadian and American politics get between elections. Obviously, Canadian coverage is a lot more prevalent, right? We have our cable news networks. We really have two. We really have the CBC News Network and the CTV News Network. They mostly focus on Canadian politics, but I mean, American elections are a big deal up here, and especially once the primary start, it's going to become tier 1 news coverage. And it's also buoyed by the fact that we get most of the American news networks in Canada. I mean, you can, with cable, you can get Fox News, you can get MSNBC, you can get CNN. So in addition to the Canadian news coverage being giving voice to the American news, you also get all the American channels. In Canada here, and this has historically been the case, that if you didn't have cable, you used to get, was it 5 channels? You'd get the CBC, which is basically the public broadcaster. You get CTV, which was like a Canadian channel. You might private network. You might get Global, which is another Canadian channel, and then you get the big 4 U.S. channels. You get ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox, and those would be the channels. So even under that system, if you didn't have cable, what was transmitted through the antennas was actually more American channels than Canadian. And radio is very similar if you lived anywhere near the border. The big radio stations would often be American. So the American influence on our media has been big, both historically and today. Oh yeah, sorry, yes, and French CBC, yeah, and French CBC. I don't know if that's do they get French CBC historically? I don't know if they got that coast to coast. I know that today they likely do because things aren't. But yeah, coming from New Brunswick at least, where I grew up in Moncton, then yeah, you got both the French and English CBC channels, kind of as basic television, and and there were more French channels in New Brunswick, in southern New Brunswick, and in the French-speaking parts of New Brunswick than there are in, say, Anglophone Ontario. And of course, if you go to Quebec, there's a lot more French channels. But in any case, no matter where you go, French Canada or English Canada, American culture has a major influence. Quebec has a bit of a way to kind of a barrier to it because Americans don't produce content in French. So Quebec has sort of a natural barrier or isolation from American culture. Of course, it's only partial, but whereas in English Canada, you can't really tell the difference between a Canadian and an American about how they sound. A lot of American shows are filmed in Canada, etc. But French Canadian stuff, by virtue of it being spoken in French, sort of creates a separation. Yeah. So.
Well, you have a question from Comrade Internet, but why don't you do your state of the channel? And then
yeah, for sure. Good. Yeah. So hey everybody, I know it's 8 o'clock, so I just want to kind of welcome everybody. We got 24 people here, which is great. Hopefully, knock on wood, no technical issues tonight, and that we won't lose some people and have to gain them back halfway or a third of the way through the stream. Before we kind of just start taking questions and having a discussion, just want to kind of thank people so far for the support of the channel. Just as we started, just a little bit before, the channel hit 2,500 subscribers, which is fantastic. Still a small channel, of course, on the grand scheme of things, but probably bigger than I would have expected to be, honestly, when I started this. And that's in thanks in large part to all the subscribers, of course, but especially the people who come to things like this, because these are the people who like the comment and watch all the video and share it on social media. And all of that helps to bring new viewers. So for those of you who do all of those things or any of those things, I'm really thankful. The Patreon as well is growing. The Patreon, I believe, now has about 35 individual patrons, averaging about $5 a patron, and working out to about $160 a month. When we get to 250, I'm going to upgrade my audio visual system to be a little bit more professional. I think, again, I'm not unhappy with what I have, but I do think it can be a little bit better, and I think that'll make it for us a more pleasurable viewing experience for folks. In terms of the type of content, now this is one challenge I'm facing, is that for whatever reason, and this has sort of been more in the last couple weeks, is that YouTube seems to be preemptively demonetizing almost anything that has to do with electoral politics, be it Canadian or American. I have to be very careful. For instance, even today, I put up a video that just mentioned Gerald Butts, Jody Wilson-Raybould, and the election. I didn't put any description, and I didn't put any tags, and it got preemptively flagged. Now, YouTube has always reversed the decision, but they've never actually said a video is demonetized and it's staying demonetized. But the reality is that for the first 12, 24, sometimes longer hours, the video doesn't get ads shown on it, or it only gets like 1 or 2 ads per 1,000 views, effectively meaning that there's no ads at all. And by then, people have stopped watching these videos because they're very much designed to be timely. You know, they're news videos, news and analysis and reaction to events. So, you know, for instance, that Bernie Sanders video I put out where, you know, Mimi Roca said that he made her skin crawl and stuff, that got about 10,000 views, but it only really started getting monetized at around view 7,000 or 8,000, meaning that about 80% of the potential monetized views were lost. So I'm at a point now where it's very difficult to make content like that. And I've tried to do things like, you know, tonight after I finish this, I might make a video, post it, see if it gets dinged. If it does, put it in for review. But sometimes the review takes longer than 12 hours and it's hard for me to post it. If the review only took 12 hours, I can make a video and then sort of delay it. It would mean that I couldn't react to news live and monetize it in the same way, but I could, you know, offer I could offer something of a you know, direct take within, you know, a day or so. But if it takes longer than that, I start facing this dilemma of, do I post a video now and lose monetized views, or do I do I not post it and then hope to save those monetized views, but then in the process the video loses impact and immediacy and relevance? And that's always the kind of debate to have, right? So this is why Patreon is really important, because if I want to keep making content that actually talks about electoral politics, until YouTube figures this algorithm thing out, or until I figure out how to work around it. And this is not only affecting me, you know, David Dole has spoken about this and that it affects him as well. And it's not always on every case. It's very random, which, if anything, makes it more frustrating. Then I'll have to look at making more content that isn't directly related to electoral politics, like the video I made on, you know, the myth of meritocracy, and my video I made on what is democratic socialism, and the video I made on, you know, building left-wing communities on YouTube. Because here's the thing, this isn't an anti-left conspiracy so far as I can tell, because I can make a video with democratic socialism in the title, and I can make a video with workers owning the means of production in the description. Of course, those things are not advertiser friendly if you're Amazon or something, but those videos didn't get dinged. It seems to be when I mention political parties or when I mention political figures, it starts to trigger. So for like another example is when I made the video on why minority parliaments are good, or why minority governments are good, or I made a video about the proportional representation. Any of those videos, they actually didn't get dinged. But once I started really bringing politicians into it, I would say about 80% of the time they get dinged. And so it makes it very difficult. So this is something I'm wrestling with, is how to make that content relevant. Now, what David does, and I haven't decided whether I'm doing this yet, is if one of his videos gets preemptively demonetized, he delays posting it and posts it on his Patreon for his patrons to see until it's monetized, upon which time he lets it go live. I don't know if I'll do that yet because I don't have a big Patreon base, but it's something that I'm considering. And in general, I think that that's the reason Patreon is very important, because it allows me to make that content and still derive value. Because, you know, this isn't just about money, but it takes a long time to make the videos. The equipment costs money. You know, the labor value has time. And, you know, a major factor is that that's something that, you know, I'm looking at. So I don't know if people have comments about this. Oh, yeah, sorry, just Brianna's going to be helping me by reading your comments and questions and helping me to gauge things. Make sure it makes it so that I'm not awkwardly looking at the screen like that. You know what I mean?
Okay, so we have a question from Comrade Internet. And he says, at this point, he's legitimately angry at the Greens for signaling willingness to work with the Conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, as you guys saw in my video that I made that was just yesterday, yeah, I agree that, FYI, that was a video that I waited about 18 hours to post, did post it, and luckily it got monetized like about half an hour after I posted it. So we got pretty lucky that most of those views count. But I mean, my argument is that, at least from what she said, it doesn't look good. Now, maybe she wants to clarify, and she actually did clarify and said, look, I'm not going to sacrifice climate change for power. But to me, that wasn't the issue, because her statement was actually quite clear. You could disagree with it, and I do, but she was clear. She said, I'm willing to work with anybody as long as they work with us on climate change. Now, the way a lot of people read that is she's willing to work with people and be multi-partisan. The way I read that is she's willing to sacrifice anything except the environment, meaning that she'll adopt, or at least be willing to adopt, Andrew Scheer's economic and social policies. And that's really troubling to me. And a lot of Greens have actually been very unhappy with me about making that point. But all I can tell them is, hey, look, don't get mad at me for covering Elizabeth May's views and drawing the logical conclusion from those views. Be mad at Elizabeth May for either believing in what she said or for being a poor communicator, or maybe a little bit of both. So I 100% agree. It's very bad. And again, it doesn't make sense politically. I know there's the potential in Canada for a kind of green-blue alliance. There's a lot of social conservatives, for instance, who have concerns about the environment. There's a sort of an ability to maybe build an alliance between farmers and Greens in certain cases. But right now, if you look at the recent polling, if the conservatives are, if conservatives switch, and conservatives are unlikely to switch, the next party they'd switch to is the NDP, and then the Liberals, and then way back the Greens. And then for the Greens, their most likely switch to is the NDP, and then the Liberals, and then way back the Conservatives. So I don't know if Elizabeth May is trying to find this mythical blue-green switcher right now, but it doesn't really exist in this election. So it makes no sense to me politically. She should have just said, we'll work with anybody who works with us. And people would have said, well, the Conservatives will never work with you. So she doesn't mean Andrew Scheer. But then she went and said, I'd even work with Andrew Scheer, which just gave direct opposite ammunition to, to progressive NDPers running in lower mainland BC or running on the BC coast and running on the island, who are saying a vote for Elizabeth May in a minority parliament may be a vote for an Andrew Scheer prime ministership. And I think that could be some very strong ammunition to save those NDP seats. And frankly, maybe John Manley isn't safe anymore because of it.
Okay, I want to shout out Lisa Hildebrandt and Denise Agliani. Thanks for your support. It's really important to us. Bruce?
Well, I just want to, So thanks, guys, for that. That's another thing here. It's something that a lot of streamers do. You have the ability to do a super chat donation. Unlike Patreon, which is sort of a commitment. Of course, you can cancel Patreon at any time. Please don't cancel your Patrons. But you can. The reality is, though, it's a kind of a monthly thing. So if you don't want to make like a monthly commitment to give $1 or $2 or $5 a month or whatever, then you can give a one-time donation through Super Chat here. On the bigger channels, they use it to sort of filter who gets talked about and what questions get answered. But there's enough with Brianna helping me, and with the fact that we, there's 31 people here, 30 people here. We still have the ability to kind of answer everyone's questions. But certainly. We're going to make sure to highlight and thank those people who have the ability and the desire to give support. Of course, again, I don't want to pressure anybody. If you don't have the means or the ability to give, I fully understand that. We're all progressives here. We very few of us have any kind of significant amount of money, so I totally get it. Yeah.
Okay, Bruce Boyles has a question, but Lisa Hildebrandt has one following up on the green question.
Yes.
She asked, Christo, some of the Greens in Europe are leaning right. Do you think the trend in North America is for Greens to go that route as well?
It's an interesting question. The Green movement is really eclectic. In some parts of Europe, you're right, the Greens have sort of adopted they sort of adopted a right of center ideology, whether it's on economic questions or whether they try to maybe attack the refugee crisis by saying, because of the ecological crisis, we can't accept refugees, and they try to use the environment as an anti-refugee wedge. On the other hand, in some European countries, the Green Party are sometimes parties that at least lean somewhat left, and then when they coalition, they often coalition with the Social Democrats or Democratic Socialists. So the Canadian Greens have always sort of been on the center right of the broad Green movement. They have never really been a right-wing party. They're not a right-wing party, but they've always sort of been on the center right. They've never been like the socialist Greens that you see in some parts of Europe. And I think our Green Party will largely remain there. I think that, Elizabeth May is leader, sort of a center-right figure. She has a history in the Conservative Party. As I noted on this channel, and that video was very controversial, she has had, let's say, complicated views about a woman's right to choose. There's indications that she'd be comfortable working with conservatives. Now, the Green Party being very new, I'm not sure if that's going to be the way it is forever. the next leader of the federal Greens could be a left-leaning figure. I don't know. The party being so decentralized in some ways and so new means that and a lot can happen. But in Canada, I would say they're pretty firmly on the center right, at least in the places where they found success. So in PEI, where they form the official opposition, they've been willing to work quite closely with the PCs there. Now in the Maritimes, I should note, I don't know if anybody here is from the Maritimes, but I grew up there. The conservative parties in the Maritimes are much less to the right when compared to the conservative parties in Ontario westward. The Conservatives and the Liberals are very similar in the Maritimes. There's very little ideological difference compared to, say, in Ontario, where you have someone like Doug Ford or Jason Kenney in Alberta. But they haven't been willing to make any significant pushes in a left-leaning direction. And of course, here in Ontario, Mike Schreiner has supported Doug Ford's attack on charter rights of workers just before Christmas, or just before New Year. Was it before Christmas or New Year's? In that kind of corridor, Kathleen Wynne, Doug Ford, and Mike Schreiner all joined together to vote away the workers' right to strike at the power company. And the NDP was the only one to support that right. And so Schreiner sided with Ford. And then, of course, in BC, that coalition, I've talked about that coalition. It's great. There's a lot of great things happening there. But the Greens have slowed down the rise to $15, and they've prevented the NDP from passing certain labor reforms. So there's a lot of concerns there. So I think there is room for the Greens and the NDP to work together, especially in the fight to get proportional representation. I think that's maybe where the alliance should be strongest. But I'm under no illusion that the Greens are a left of center party. I would say that they're similar ideologically to the Liberals, sometimes to the left of the Liberals, sometimes to the right of Liberals, depending on the part of the country and the leaders in question.
Okay, so Bruce Boyle says, what do you think of Trudeau, and are you going to vote for him?
No, I'm a card-carrying New Democrat. I've noted that on the channel. I'm voting for Jagmeet Singh in the NDP. Here in Kingston, our candidate is Barrington Walker. He's a fantastic candidate. He's a historian, the son of auto workers, the son of immigrants. And he's a diverse candidate. He's a Jamaican Canadian. He brings all sorts of experience and worldviews that I think are going to make him a strong candidate. Kingston's a liberal stronghold federally, so we're up for a fight, but we're going to take it seriously and do our best. That's who I'm voting for. I mean, Trudeau is what Trudeau is. I mean, I wrote a book on his father. I've written a lot on his father. You can see a lot of the books here in the background are on Trudeau because my doctoral dissertation was on Pierre Trudeau and his ties to the NDP and to the labor movement. Trudeau, I think, is kind of what I always expected him to be, which was sort of a liar. And I knew he was disingenuous. He was disingenuous, but a lot of Canadians, and maybe not my listeners, because you guys are kind of politics nerds, and maybe some of you are history buffs, they forget their history, and they forget that the Liberal Party, it's a cliche, they run from the center left, but they govern from the center right, and that sometimes they govern from further right than the center right. Under Chrétien, for instance, his cuts made Stephen Harper's cuts look tame. Pierre Trudeau had labor union leaders jailed. Stephen Harper never did that. He never arrested union leaders during his tenure. And so the reality is that I'm not really surprised, but I get why a lot of Canadians are disappointed, because Trudeau did excite a lot of people. It's why he won his majority. Trudeau didn't really win by taking votes away from the NDP or the Conservatives, at least not in general. Trudeau largely won because the voter turnout went like 10%, and they almost all went to him. And so he energized young people who, of course, knew nothing but Stephen Harper in their adult lives. And he energized Indigenous people, for instance, who, of course, are clamoring rightfully for justice that's been denied to them. And Trudeau has let both of those groups down, Indigenous people especially. So I get why people are disappointed, but I have to say, as a historian, as somebody who studied the Trudeau family, as somebody who studied the Liberal Party, I mean, this is what I expected. You know, I knew the moment that election was over, electoral reform, that was a promise broken, 100%, and like so many others. And now Trudeau's even at the point where he's rebaking his promises. He said in 2015 he would honor all 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And of course, a lot of those have not been honored. And now he's saying he's sort of going to honor them all again this time, knowing that he's lying again. I guarantee you he's lying again. And so Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau are very similar in this case, where, you know, they both sort of lied to get in power. But the nature of our system is, once you get that majority, It's a half-decade dictatorship. You know, you have often it takes 4 years, but you have up to 5 years of unassailable power. There's nothing that can remove you, and you can get it with 40% of the vote. And there was even Frank Graves from Ecos. He has the NDP pretty low in his poll numbers, so naturally I think he's wrong. But he suggested that Justin Trudeau could win 190 some seats with less than 35% of the vote. Put another way, Trudeau could win a bigger majority than he has now with less than 1/3 of Canadians voting for him. Now, I don't think he's right. I think that's a little off. But the reality is we could have a situation here where we get a woefully unrepresentative government, be it liberal or conservative. And I mean, there's no way I'll never vote for the Liberal Party. I'll probably always vote NDP. But if I didn't vote NDP, it certainly wouldn't be for the Liberals or Greens or Conservatives. I wouldn't vote for any of the mainstream parties except for the NDP.
Okay, Wesley Wiles is giving you some good tips on demonetization, so you're gonna want to go back and read those.
Yeah.
So Drew M asks, what's your opinion on former Premier Rachel Notley's government as a social democratic government in the most conservative province?
I mean, that's a good one. I was critical. I mean, obviously I was happy Notley won. I think we all were. We were all shocked that she won. Maybe not shocked that she won because the polls were indicating she was likely going to win on that night, but shocked that in a few weeks she went from being, third place with a caucus that could fit in a small car to, a hyper majority. And I mean, we were excited, and they did some great things. They were the first province and currently the only province to have a $15 minimum wage. And they started that process early, and that's great. That an NDP government did that. And the only other province that's going towards that is the NDP government in BC, which, of course, I think would be going faster if not for the Greens sort of holding the balance of power. Some people disagree with me on that. Some people say the NDP is using it as an excuse, but I don't agree. In terms of Notley, I feel that when she was on the right path, potentially, under the assumption that the Wild Rose and PCs didn't merge, because I thought there was a chance for her to win again. Maybe it was a minority government, but she had a chance to be the biggest party in the legislature again by being relatively cautious. But once the UCP formed, to me, it was over. And anybody who thought it wasn't over was lying to themselves. They won with a huge majority, despite all their scandals. Even if the NDP got 5 more points and the Conservatives 5 less points, they probably still would have won. The reality is she should have governed to lose. And by that, I mean she should have been a lot bolder. She should have raised the minimum wage to $18 an hour. She should have made for free tuition. She should have created a provincial sales tax. She should have instituted dental care or pharmacare or one of those things. She should have actually kept her promise and gone after the oil companies. And if they failed, nationalize one of them without compensation or tank the oil price, tank the validity of the market to nationalize. I'm not saying any one of those things are something she should have 100% done, but I don't think she considered realistically any of these things. And so in this election, she ran on childcare, but why didn't she just do childcare? Why didn't she just do it? Just do childcare. Make $15 a day childcare, and then on a sliding scale, free for low-income people, max $15 a day childcare. Done. Do it. You have 4 years. Get that done. Implement programs that are popular and that even the UCP will have a hard time justifying to get rid of. Do those things. And she didn't do any of those things. And I think that's Rachel Notley's biggest flaw. I was also concerned with some, and a lot of Albertan NDPers will say, well, the NDP and the rest of Canada sort of sold the NDP out in Alberta because we didn't support the pipelines. But I'll tell you that the Alberta NDP, got a lot of BC NDP volunteers in that 2015 election. And yet in 2017, and I've heard that a lot of NDPers were discouraged and some staff were prevented from going to volunteer for John Horgan. So they benefited from John Horgan's help and the BC NDP's help, and they wouldn't reciprocate. We had an academic conference and I don't know if anybody is here from that conference, but we had an academic conference in Calgary a year before the election where we talked about the history of the CCF NDP, because as you guys may know, the CCF was founded in Calgary in 1932. And so we went to the Legion where it was founded. And Alberta NDP staffers were barred from attending the conference because at one of the segments, and only one of the segments, Avi Lewis was there. And because he attended one thing, they were effectively banned from attending the rest of the conference. And again, this was largely a pro-CCF NDP audience. I don't know if I have the book up here. The book came out of it. If you guys want to read it, it's great. It's called Party of Conscience. It's basically a series of articles about the past, present, and future of the NDP, largely from a pro-NDP perspective. But they were barred from attending because they didn't want to associate with the NDP from the other parts of the country. So I was really left with a sour taste in my mouth. And even Rachel Notley now that she's lost, she says Jagmeet Singh doesn't care about working class people. Well, that's balderdash, like 100%. The NDP 100% cares about working class people. And I think Notley in some ways is carrying water for Trudeau and for Scheer when she says things like that. So I don't want to go too much more and get myself in trouble with the Alberta folks, but that's really what I believe. And I mean, if you guys want a good take on Alberta, although they're more critical of the federal party than I am, listen to the Alberta Advantage podcast because they're pretty good.
Okay. Omar Almasi says, do the Bloc have a role to play in a coalition government?
You know, a lot of people would say no. And I don't know if I'm not speaking as an NDP figure here, but I think that any party should play a role in a coalition if they feel they can work with those parties. And I know a lot of people in 2008 were very concerned because, you know, if you guys remember, Stephen Harper had a minority government, but it was a pretty big minority, and it needed the NDP and the Liberals and the Bloc to outvote him. And so a lot of conservatives were using this is a takeover by separatists and socialists to destroy the Canadian state and what have you. And of course, the NDP and the Liberals were clear. The Bloc would support us, but they would not be an actual part of the coalition. But that nuance was lost on people. So I get why people would be reluctant to include the Bloc. But I mean, at the end of the day, they're a political party with interests. And if they can say, go to a party and argue, look, we want you to help us with our project to promote the interest of Quebec, and in exchange, we'll help you promote your interests for Canada. I don't have any fundamental issue with that. Some people have actually suggested maybe that if Andrew Scheer is in a minority position, maybe he'll try to form a coalition with the Bloc. And that'll be very interesting to see, you know, how, Western conservatives will react to Andrew Scheer building a coalition with Quebec, French-Canadian separatists. But that might happen. But I think right now, the most likely outcome of a coalition wouldn't actually be a coalition. It would be, for instance, if the polls are accurate right now, the NDP being the Liberals with forming a minority government with the NDP supporting them on a supply and confidence basis. Basically, the NDP making demands and the Liberals implementing those demands, but likely not a formal coalition where, say Jagmeet Singh becomes Justin Trudeau, one of Justin Trudeau's cabinet minister, and Justin Trudeau says makes a third of his cabinet NDP. I don't think you'll see that happening, but you might see Green and NDP support help a liberal government keep power. Now, again, we don't know what's going to happen. The election's a long ways away. The NDP might win this election still. We don't know. So, I don't want to speculate, but that's the most likely outcome right now. And it makes sense, too, because some of the polling I've seen, the only two parties the NDP is the only third party that has enough seats to give either the Liberals or Conservatives a majority right now, because both the Bloc and Greens just don't have enough seats to push them over the top.
Okay, some guy from Vancouver. What do you think of Canada stepping in to aid the U.S. concentration camps? What ideas do you have that we can act on to remove America's third safe country status?
I mean, in terms of what we can do, I think we have to draw the connection for Canadians. And I think the reality is that most Canadians are appalled. And if you saw a poll by Abacus, the poll by Abacus suggested that in Canada, basically everyone hates Trump. 96% of NDPers do not like him, I think, or 94% hate him, 4% or something like that. Most of us hate him. Most Liberals and Greens hate him. Even about half of Conservatives hate him, which is a lot. You'd think even the Conservatives don't like a Republican president. But our government is in effect endorsing Trump's concentration camp policy. And that's the reality, that as long as Canada recognizes the US as a safe country for refugees, then anything the US does to refugees and to undocumented people, what have you, is being endorsed by Canada. I've made a video about this. I've talked about this. Liberals do not like when I say that, but it's 100% true. We only recognize the US. We don't recognize Sweden and Finland and Norway and Denmark and, Iceland and, actual decent countries as safe for refugees. We only recognize the US, only the US and no other country. So it's Canada saying to the US and to itself and to the world, what Trump's doing, we see that as safe. And it's not just what he's doing to undocumented people. It's directly connected to how he's talked about Ocasio-Cortez and Presley and Tlaib and Omar. It's directly connected. So when Justin Trudeau complains about any of those things and keeps that policy, he's endorsing Trump's actions. And I think we have to put pressure. Other than that, though, I don't know what we can do, because Justin Trudeau has a majority and he wants that policy and he'll keep it. And if we're being honest, the Conservatives support it as well. So the NDP is sort of, I don't know the Green position on this, if I'm being honest. I don't know if they've articulated it. Maybe somebody knows. The NDP is the only official party, I believe, that's come out and said, we want to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement. So we're sort of isolated, but I think it's about letting people know, hey, Canadian, there's an 80% chance you hate Trump. What about Justin Trudeau effectively giving legitimacy to Donald Trump's actions? Doesn't that make you angry? I think maybe we need to have more of those conversations with folks. Maybe that'll help. But I don't know. I don't know what the ultimate solution is. If the Liberals and Conservatives both agree on something, we're kind of screwed, because they're about 70% of the electorate, and at least currently sitting in Parliament, and they have like 80% of the seats. So it's very difficult to oppose a united Liberal Conservative bloc.
Okay. Leakum9 says, do you think it's fair to say that the reason there aren't more radical left folks is the moderate Canadian national identity?
I mean, to a certain degree, yeah. I think Canadians have this inherent small c conservatism, this like reservedness. I think that Canada historically and today has been among the more successful capitalist societies at either dulling or masking the inherent inequalities and contradictions of capitalism in a way that, say, the United States hasn't, given the deep racial and economic inequalities that are even bigger than they are here. And of course, we have our Indigenous people, and our treatment of them are not our Indigenous people. Sorry, I shouldn't use that language. But we have Indigenous people in this country who are treated extremely poorly. But unlike the African American or Hispanic populations in the United States, they're a smaller proportion of the population, and they don't conglomerate in areas like the African American population and the Hispanic population does. And also the U.S. has deeper inequalities. Our mother country, England, has deep inequalities rooted both in pure material inequality, but also in a more rigid class system. You could tell someone's class by an accent in England in a way you can't in Canada. I think Brianna here told me a story about how the Queen, at least for a while, could tell which neighborhood you were from in London by your accent, because it mattered. So you were from a working class, poor part of London with that accent, and you were maybe from a kind of blue collar middle class, maybe a skilled tradesman part of the city with that accent, or you were with money, but you were new money with that accent, or you were an actual blue-blooded noble or royal with that accent. That doesn't exist in Canada. And so for a long time, I think Canada, more than most societies, has really weathered that. And even in Scandinavia, which has a longer history of more equality of its people, Canada, unlike those countries, never went through the crushing poverty that World War II and the Great Depression levied. Canada went through the Great Depression, but unlike most of Europe, we got to reap the benefits of war production. Both Canada and the USA got rich and industrialized off the suffering of Europe. We were lucky to do that. The reality is that while they were both allies and Axis nations were blowing one another up, and we went over to fight with our allies, Canada and the USA built the post-war industrial economy in each of those countries, and they became effectively the two most prosperous countries in the world. And that meant that while we did build a kind of post-war social security program, Canadians were not as willing to experiment as people in Britain and Scandinavia and Germany were, because those societies in some cases had to literally be reconstructed. Like if you look at a picture of post-war Berlin, and you can see how new social orders in some cases were built out of the rubble, the literal and figurative rubble. And this is why in 1945, the Labour Party wins in Britain, Clement Attlee, and he ushers in a pretty radical program. Whereas in 1945 in Canada, the CCF starts that election polling very well, but Canadians, being more cautious with more to lose because the economy is stronger, stick with Mackenzie King and the Liberal Party, unlike in most of Europe, survives to be one of the two big parties and isn't replaced by a Labour or Democratic Socialist or Social Democratic Party.
Okay, Denise is just relaying a story that after the U.S. election, there was a guy in a streetcar that yelled, "Make America Great Again." What do you think about left or right-wing politics in the U.S. radicalizing the right wing in Canada?
Oh, it's the connections are clear as day. I mean, you guys remember Kelly Leach? You guys remember her? Well, the I don't know if you guys remember this, but like the night Trump won, the conservatives were sort of in the middle of their leadership race, or it was just ramping up or something. I remember this. And she sent out an email to her supporters basically being like, our brothers to the South proved they could do it, and we can do it here too. And I think Canadian right-wingers saw Trump as an example forward. And this is really ironic because after 2012, after Obama's win in 2012, conservatives looked to Canada. And we might scoff at this, but they saw Stephen Harper as the future of world conservatism. They saw in Stephen Harper a guy who in 2011 won a majority, yes, by getting a lot of rural whites to vote for him, of course, but specifically doing very well amongst certain ethnic minorities in places like the 905 and in even maybe not downtown Toronto, but like Toronto and in big cities. He did well amongst those populations. And so they went and said, look, the realities of the United States is it's becoming less white than it's ever been, and it'll only become less white. We need to find a way of winning minorities. Let's look at what Stephen Harper did. And the conservatives did this very well. They published their work in non-English and non-French speaking newspapers, community newspapers and websites. The conservatives did that outreach better than anybody, better than the liberals, and certainly better than the NDP. But with Trump's win, it seems like they've forgotten all of that. And they said, no, we're going to be white nationalists. Or at the very least, we're going to be a welcoming party for white nationalists. And I think that the American influence has been massive. And I think that beyond the Conservative Party, it certainly had an impact on emboldening the Canadian online alt-right. But Canada's played a role in that too, because if you look at the major figures in the alt-right, a lot of them are Canadian. Lauren Southern is Canadian, Faith Goldy is Canadian, Stefan Molyneux is Canadian, Jordan Peterson is Canadian. A lot of these folks are Canadian. And then there's the Rebel, and who collaborates with a lot of these sources. A lot of the biggest voices, a lot of the vilest voices of the alt-right are Canadian. And so in some ways, the American influence has been big, but Canada is an exporter of hate on the internet. It's not an award you want to win, but per capita, we probably produce a good amount more alt-right stuff than the Americans do. If we think about like the big voices that have sort of risen in the age of Trump. And I don't know if that's a reaction to Justin Trudeau, because I think a lot of us on my channel, a lot of us like us, we sort of know that Trump is, or that Trudeau, isn't really a left-winger, but the conservatives just think he's the Antichrist. And as such, there's this reaction to him. And I think that's driven a lot of Canadian alt-right people. And again, as I noted in my most recent video just earlier today on building a left-wing presence on YouTube, the reality is here on this platform, the right has been very successful at collaborating with one another. And they've created these massive channels and these massive networks that have sort of fed into one another. And we just don't have a counter narrative on the left or even the center here in Canada on like digital spaces.
Okay. Daily BMJ says he's an Alberta lefty. He says, I feel all social democratic models are structured to support a generic life that doesn't look like mine. Accepting one means I work harder to get to the same place. If you were me, who would you vote for?
You know, like it depends what you mean by a generic life, right? I mean, in a sense, it's about expanding opportunity and equality. You know, there would be higher taxes, I suppose, in a sense, if you're a very high earner. Would that limit your earning potential or your take-home pay? Perhaps. But I mean, if you look at the core tenets of what the NDP is running on this time, it's about providing increased services for people. It's about providing increased access to what many Canadians have, but too many do not. And it's primarily levied on taxes on the very, very wealthy, and frankly, only modest increases. So I don't know if that would necessarily demand a generic life. And I understand that there are some concerns with, you know, an old socialist model that is overly reliant on, say, centralized state planning. But of course, you know, you can have government ownership that I think is a good idea when it challenges the market and when it takes services that should be basic rights and removes the profit motive. But the ownership doesn't strictly need to be, the Canadian state out of Ottawa running it through bureaucrats. Cities and provinces and regions can own things. Workers and cooperatives can own things. And I think that, from my view, the main goal of socialism is democracy. It's to democratize people's experience with their day-to-day life. Because right now, for too many people, they have the right to vote every couple of years, but then their workplace is an autocracy, and on an individual basis, they have no sort of control over their daily life. General Motors, for instance, gets to decide who does and doesn't build cars in Oshawa. No one's asking. I mean, and rank and file NDPers at the Ontario NDP convention put forward a motion to nationalize GM in Oshawa. But I mean, Justin Trudeau, no one's asking, hey, why don't we just build cars through a crown corporation and build green cars and build green transit? Everyone just assumes that a private company gets to decide what does and doesn't get built, and we just have to kind of sit there and take it. And to me, that's not a democratic society. That's not a society with sovereignty. And I think that, you know, if that leads to generic natures, I mean, I don't know if I agree. Now, some people have argued that certain ways of approaching social services need to be more flexible for the modern life. For instance, some people have complained about how an NDP-style approach to daycare will leave out people who need nighttime care or weekend care or things of that sort, and that if daycare becomes a school-like model, then it'll only serve those people who work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and don't work on holidays, and et cetera, et cetera. I think those are legitimate criticisms, but it doesn't mean that the system is broken. It just means that the system needs to be cognizant of the diverse needs. Diverse, and I mean that in all fashions: economically, socially, religiously, culturally, ethnically, you know, geographically diverse nature. And I think that's my approach. I don't know if that answers your question. It was something broad. Was that the super chat?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So just a minute. And again, thank you so much for your donation. I very much appreciate that. I very much appreciate it.
Okay. So this question comes from Matthew Daniels and Leakum Nines. Historically speaking, what paths have pushed Canadians to progressive action, and are there lucrative parallels to build on today?
What paths?
Yes.
Well, you know, big factors are often, and this is where, because I've taken a lot from Gramsci, is that, you know, when there are crises of capitalism, we often see new opportunities. And so there are crises of capitalism when, you know, in crises of the common sense of capitalism, new opportunities are built and new reforms are won and new movements are built. And I think that those moments are ones that have to be seized. And so that's where the Winnipeg General Strike comes from. And you see the birth of the end of two-party politics in Canada is the end of World War II, and it's the economic, or end of World War I, it's the economic crisis. Out of that rises the Progressive Party and Farmers' Parties and Labor parties, and out of that, and the Communist Party rises in 1921. And the CCF comes sort of out of those farmer labor progressive roots. And those things changed Canada forever and led to a lot of progress. It forced liberal and conservative governments to be more responsive to the needs of regular people, be they farmers or workers or what have you. And it was out of that, and again, World War II, the Great Depression led to those crises. And out of that, it led to the creation of the welfare state, and it led to the greater recognition of unions, and it led to, Keynesian economics, for all its limitations, changing, taking away that laissez-faire. Now, these crises of capitalism can also move us to the right. The crises of capitalism in the 1970s did bring about a new left, but the right, the neoliberals, won out of that crisis, and in so doing sort of destroyed large elements of the welfare state, or at least neutered them and prevented them from growing. But we're still in, I think, a long crisis of capitalism right now that started in 2008, but never really ended. And I think that this is a great opportunity to bring back old ideas that are still valuable and to propose new ones. And this is why I think you're seeing parties that have, whether it was the Labour Party in Britain that sort of stagnated under Blair, or even the Democrats that have been terrible for most of their history, are now, at least the average Democratic voter, it supports Bernie Sanders' vision for America. And again, there's a lot of limits to Bernie, but his vision is something that 10 years ago would be insane in America. And likewise, Jeremy Corbyn, before he became leader of the Labour Party, was a kook backbench MP that no one listened to, but he kind of kept the dream alive of this vision. And even a lot of people are critical of Jagmeet Singh, but Jagmeet Singh's platform is the most left-wing thing we've seen from a federal party since at least the mid 80s. And it's driven in part because social democratic parties are seeing that there's an increased skepticism of capitalism, even if people don't know what capitalism is and exactly what their problem with it is. People kind of get a sense that things are not fair right now. And there were polls done that said that even a majority of conservatives support a wealth tax. And I think there's a real appetite for change right now. So I think those moments of crisis need to be seized. A project I'm working on, a biography of A.R. Moser. He's a labor leader, or was a labor leader, and he was the head of one of the federations of labor in Canada at the end of World War II. And he said that this is a historic moment for the left and for labor in this country. That right now we could build socialism because the economy was already being publicly planned and operated. There were still private owners, but the state was already effectively managing the broad strokes of the economy. And they argue we should just keep doing it. We should just keep doing what we're doing in wartime, just do it. And he said that if we fail now to install a democratic socialist society, it will take another revolution for us to have a chance again. And in some ways he was right, because Canada had never really been able to build mass opinion amongst the left, or even union members, to support a democratic socialist agenda. Although maybe now we're moving in such a direction given higher levels of inequality and things of that sort.
Right. Omar says Elizabeth Warren has said the market is headed towards another crash. If one does happen, how will that affect Canadian politics? More austerity from conservatives and liberals?
I mean, it'll be an interesting approach. I mean, timing's important. In terms of politics, when you're in government and the recession hits, it's most likely to hurt you. I mean, George W. Bush was unpopular, obviously, when he left. But the reason in part that Obama won such a big victory was, of course, he energized people. Unlike Hillary Clinton, he got non-voters to come out and vote. And voter turnout was very high in 2008. It's one of the reasons the Democrats won not only the presidency, but won almost 60 seats in the Senate and won the House, and all of those sorts of things. But it was driven in part because of the market crash. And in Canada, we sort of weathered that storm better, and Stephen Harper was able to survive that. But the reality is that if it hits, let's say, this summer and there's a crash, it's going to be bad news for Trudeau and it's going to be bad news for Trump. I mean, the only thing that I think is keeping Trump from absolutely cratering is that, at least on the metrics, on the capitalist metrics, the American economy is doing well. And so I think some people are keeping their support for Trump because of that. But if he loses that, what does he have? And Trudeau, I think similarly, a lot of liberals will say, well, the economy's so hot, why would you risk anything else? Well, what if the economy stops being hot? What does Trudeau have then? His personal brand is tanked since the SNC scandal and his feud with Wilson Raybould and Philpott. I think that's a big factor in terms of how our politics respond. You could see a push towards austerity. Yeah, I do think that's potentially the case. Although, maybe given that 2008 is recently in people's minds, you might see the left seize on that moment more effectively this time and maybe urge and say, well, now is not the time for austerity. Now is the time to fundamentally take a different approach, because twice in 10 years, we've seen a major market crash. And this is proving that the capitalist system, at least is structured, it has these things are normal and they're not exceptional. And we know, anybody who studies history, there were major crashes in the 1870s, and there were crashes in the 1910s, and there were crashes obviously in the 30s, and even in the 50s there were issues. It wasn't crashes but major inflation. In the 70s there was economic downturn, and then there was the dot-com boom. Like every 20 years at most, it seems, something major happens under capitalist economies that causes them to break. And we all seem to forget about it. But maybe if it happens in rapid succession, we'll see some people start to learn their lesson. Although history has shown that we've kind of just decided to stick with capitalism, although tweaked.
Okay, so Dadarev says, one interesting thing I've also noted in North American lefties in general is the apologetic attitude towards a proto-fascist Russia. What do you think about that?
I mean, Russia's really interesting. Russia is not Putin's not a good guy at all. And Russia's got some real troubling things. And it's not just Putin. I mean, their democracy is questionable. But even in the broad strokes, I mean, the Duma, I think, decriminalized domestic violence. And basically everybody but 3 or 4, I don't know what they call them, MPs or members of the Duma, voted for that. So it seems to me that even in their rigged democracy, even if their democracy wasn't rigged, they're doing things like making it easier to do violence against women and violence against your spouse and things like that. So Russia's not a good guy. I do think it's reasonable to point out in some ways the way in which Russia has a desire to see a more destabilized West. But I feel my concern is that it's being used not as a legitimate discussion of Russia's role in the rise of a new right, but being used to excuse everything. It's not part of the conversation for a lot of liberals. It's the only thing. And it's nonsensical. You'll see major Americans saying, well, why is Trump siding with communist Russia? And they're not joking. They literally think Putin's a communist. And again, they're and because people don't have this knowledge, they're not getting the fundamental contradictions, which is Russia is a kind of a more rigid form of capitalism, but it's a form of capitalism nonetheless. And if Russia's the bad guy, then Russia is the bad guy in part because of a certain form of capitalism they have. And I feel it's being used to excuse the fact that the Democrats lost because they didn't campaign in Wisconsin. I'm not a Bill Clinton fan, but there was all these reports after the election where Bill Clinton was talking to the campaign team. It's like, why is Hillary not going to Wisconsin, Michigan? Why is she not going to those states? Go to those states, Hillary. There was a bus of union supporters for the Democrats who were sitting in Iowa basically being like, hey, should we go across the border to one of these swing states and help? And Hillary said, we don't need you there. We want you to stay in Iowa because we want Trump to think that we're competing for Iowa so they get scared. That was a thing that happened. Vladimir Putin did not hack that bus. Vladimir Putin did not tell Hillary Clinton, like, Hillary, don't go to Wisconsin. So I feel like to the extent to which, Putin had an effect, it should be noted. But bigger factors are the United States makes it harder for poor people and young people and black people and Hispanic people to vote. The Democrats ran a crappy election with a crappy candidate, and whether or not Hillary would have won in a fair contest against Bernie, I don't know, but they put their finger on the scale for the objectively poor performing candidate. And she ran an awful campaign, and they didn't recognize that outside of New York and California and Washington and the coastal states, things were not good. and that's why they lost. That's the thing. So it's like everyone's like, let's blame Putin, but like to me, Putin's a factor in why Trump won, and Putin's a factor in the rise of this alt-right. But I wouldn't put Putin in the top 10 reasons of either of those things. Those things are being driven by domestic concerns, domestic racism, and domestic policy. And that's why I'm concerned about that. And of course, like, look, it's not Russia that has taken all of the countries surrounding the United States and put arms in those countries. I mean, there's no Cuban Missile Crisis anymore. And yet the United States has literally built, has encircled, Russia. And whether or not it's to quote unquote defend those countries from Russian aggression, or whether it's to quote unquote, send a message to Russia, the reality is that like this is a longer term issue. And I just don't see Russia as the unequivocal enemy. And of course, a lot of Canada's allies, not all Ukrainians, of course, but Canada in some ways is willing to align with some very troubling forces in Eastern Europe that are no better than Putin and maybe worse than Putin. And so I don't know if we're even really the good guy in some of those conflicts. So that's my general perspective. I don't want to go any deeper than that because like I'm not an expert on Russia. Putin's a bad guy, and I mean Russia's not a real democracy, but he's not the reason for most of our flaws. That's our own fault.
Okay, so there's talk about how the Koch brothers are influencing some of the right-wing dialogue through media and some of the companies they own, and how that becomes easier for then these right-wing ideas to become like core ideas in the American populace. And actually we just got a question from Laura was here. What are the best ways for people to become more knowledgeable in politics?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of for just to quickly, I mean, the way that the mainstream, that these media sources work is that they, and I mean, the Koch brothers they fund some YouTubers, they fund some YouTube channels and some individual YouTubers to effectively create media networks. And the way it works is that they take some very far right-wing ideas in some time and sort of give them mainstream legitimacy. And it's sort of that, the concept of the Overton window, they pull it rightward. They sort of release these ideas into the political mainstream or into the political dialogue. And the Republican Party doesn't necessarily adopt them, at least at first, because doing so would be unpopular. But the ideas gain prominence, and then they can be adopted by political parties. And I mean, the left has done this historically. This is what the NDP has done in some ways. The NDP talked about pharmacare or Medicare, when the liberals and conservatives were horrified by the concept, and eventually it became policy. And the NDP were the only party that wanted to give Chinese and Japanese Canadians the right to vote. And now the idea of not letting Chinese and Japanese Canadians vote would be abhorrent to people. And at the time, the CCF was attacked as being anti-white for taking that policy. So there is this general idea that groups outside of the center need to sort of diffuse their ideas into the mainstream, and the Koch brothers are a key aspect of that. So they're, in a sense, taking this long-range project. And in terms of getting more knowledgeable in politics, I mean, I think that, it's about, reading broadly. I mean, I hope my channel helps people get more knowledgeable. I hope I offer a bit of that perspective. But, watching a bunch of different sources, reading the mainstream media for all of its flaws, but yes, read the mainstream media, but also read sources outside the mainstream. Those sources have flaws sometimes, but they often do stuff that the mainstream media won't do or can't do, doesn't have the flexibility to do. So read broadly and read, from a variety of different sources. At least from my perspective, Twitter and Facebook are often good because I have a lot of friends that are interested in politics. So I often, it's a bit of an echo chamber, if I'm being honest, because a lot of my friends are on the left, but they do highlight stories. And of course, places like Reddit are really good. Reddit's really good, despite, again, all of its flaws, to kind of get a sense for what's happening in the news, to follow those things. And of course, you could certainly, reading history is good. Reading political history is very good because it allows you to really get a sense for how things have developed. And history is really good because often in politics and contemporary politics, we want to assume that everything is unique and has never happened before. So for instance, the right wing, stuff like this has never happened before, or automation has never happened before and we don't know how to deal with it. But it's happened time and time again throughout history. Crises between capital and labor have happened. How minority groups have fought for their rights has happened before. And so a historical knowledge gives you a greater nuance of today's politics. So I think, and biased as I am, somebody who's a historian, at least a historian by training, I think a good historical knowledge gives you a better, can give you direct political knowledge, but I think it gives you a good way of understanding politics. And I think one thing, you don't need to know mathematics. Basic data literacy is important. Look at how to read graphs and be critical. I've talked about this on my channel. Look beyond the headlines. For instance, there was a poll that had Biden in first, Bernie Sanders in second, Harris in third, and Warren in fourth. And the headline literally read, Biden in first, Harris and Warren tied for third. Now, of course, what are they leaving out? They're leaving out Bernie because they're relying on you in this deluge of news to not actually click and read the article and only focus on the headline and literally ignore Bernie existing. So read beyond the headline too. And that's actually a danger. That's a thing on Reddit and Facebook and Twitter. Often you'll see a news article posted on Reddit, and most of the comments, they didn't read the article. You know what I mean? Or the Twitter chain, no one read the article. And that gives people an excuse to write misleading headlines, because if they ever get called out, they can say, well, if you read the article, it's very clear what I was saying. But, so you be media literate in that sense.
Okay, Mary J. Has asked, do you have any economists you support?
So call it the donation. So I know that.
Okay, it's donation.
Yeah. So yes, Mary, thanks so much for the donation. I really appreciate that. I mean, in terms of economists, I mean, I'm a big fan of not a huge name, but I don't know if anybody here knows Michael Rosworski. He's sort of an economist by training. He wrote that book, or co-wrote that book, The Republic of Walmart, which is a really good take about how, in a sense, we can use 21st century capitalist structures to build socialism, which is sort of what Marx always suggested, because Marx always suggested that capitalism is bad, but it's a part of the historical trajectory towards socialism. And in a sense, the bourgeoisie have served their historical role, and eventually their role will end. And Rosworski has noted that big companies like Walmart and Amazon have sort of demonstrated how you can build effectively globalized planning structures, and you could turn those things into socialized structures as well. And he's got a lot of cred for that. He's very good. He has a podcast. I don't know if it's still running right now. It's called Political Economy, like A is in A for Canada, the stereotype. Look him up. I've been a guest on his podcast. Other economists, sort of a centrist type, but Robert Reich is sort of an economic thinker who I still think is too liberal. He wants to quote unquote save capitalism. But I want you to look at Robert Reich as an example of how far our discourse has penetrated the centrist circles now, where we're mainstream again. The left is sort of mainstream. Robert Reich was a Clinton cabinet, I don't know, a minister. They don't have cabinet ministers, but he was part of the Clinton cabinet. And now he's sort of a guy who's calling for wealth taxes and bigger inheritance taxes. And he's talking about, the vision of building an economy. And of course, he wants to save capitalism. But in the end of the day, he's an ally in trying to build a more just society. Of course, Thomas Piketty has offered some really good proposals and things like that. Those are some of the big ones I've read into right now. But there's other economists. There's the I forget what it's called. The Progressive Economics Forum here in Canada. A lot of them are more center left, but they have some lefter leaning people, and so they've offered some really interesting takes. There's Jim Stanford. He used to work for Unifor, and now I think he's in Australia. Again, Unifor and a lot of their people way too pro anything but conservative voting for my taste. But I mean, he offers an interesting take on questioning neoliberal orthodoxy.
Okay, Lisa Hildebrand has asked, has NDP leader Jagmeet Singh put himself out there in support of the Alberta LGBTQ community regarding eliminating gay conversion therapy in Canada, and will it be brought forward in the House?
I don't know if Jagmeet has spoke specifically on that. Just today, though, I saw at least a couple MPs, one of them, and candidates talk about it. Sven Robinson, of course, a fairly high-profile candidate running in BC, has kind of criticized and of course, Canada's first openly gay MP in the country's history. And a historical tidbit: back in the '80s, he sat on the committee that drafted the charter. And when no one else would, the Liberals and Conservatives on that committee, he said, hey, under Section 15, we should put sexual orientation under protected classes. So to say that you can't discriminate on race, he was the one that got disability included. He fought to include, being gay or lesbian or bisexual. I don't know if he included transgender people. It was a different time. But he fought for that and lost. But of course, he would win in the long run, as the Supreme Court would confirm that even though it's not said in there, it includes GLBTQ and 2S peoples and what have you. The reality is that he's talked about how the Liberals are punting this down the line on a jurisdictional issue, saying they don't have the right to do this. And I think that Sven Robinson, a lot of the NDP MPs want to make this an issue. And I do feel that there probably is stuff the federal government can do. The BC, and of course the Alberta NDP has been fighting this, and in many provinces where it has been banned, NDPers have led the charge. Sherry DeNovo, she's now retired, but she was a United Church minister and champion for gay rights, longtime gay rights champion here in Ontario. Has made a lot of fights against conversion therapy and in favor of trans rights. And I know that we support that general project to ban conversion therapy. And this is a troubling thing with the Liberals, because I think in general, they want to be seen as pro-LGBT, but the reality is whether they're sort of playing jurisdictional football here, or whether it's on the, Trudeau promised to reverse the ban on gay men donating blood, and then sort of backed off on that. And it kind of kept that stigma around men who have sex with men are fundamentally dirty and can't donate blood, even though studies have shown that that's not necessarily the case. The Trudeau government has sort of kept that policy, and a lot of people in the gay community are very troubled by that. And the NDP supports that reversing that policy as well. I mean, I could look this up about Jagmeet on that specific issue, but I don't know if he's spoken on it himself.
Okay. Datarev is asking why the situation with Indigenous people in Canada is so bad. He says that was truly a surprise. And he says that one weird thing is that not too many people seem to realize that investing in social programs can save money in the long run.
Yeah, so on the first one, which is a lot easier, because talking about Indigenous people is very difficult. I'll get to that. But on the first point, social programs, you're 100% right that social programs have real economic value, and that, when you talk about things to invest in that create economic value, education and healthcare are among the better ones, because they not only create good jobs, and those good jobs help to strengthen communities, and because, we need schools and hospitals everywhere, they create good jobs even in communities that are struggling right now. So it helps buoy local economies. Where there are good jobs for teachers and nurses and doctors and things like that, there are small businesses that can survive. So there's good spin-off effects. And another factor is cost savings. One of the things that we've talked about at the NDP, and then academic research from the University of British Columbia has corroborated, is that over the medium and long term, you save money when you provide pharmacare, because pharmaceutical things are often preventative care, or they serve as better and cheaper alternatives to hospital care. So right now, you're sick, you can go see a doctor and you don't have to pay for it. That's great. Like Canada, it's a good thing we have that. But the doctor will give you a prescription, and you may or may not be able to afford that, because you may or may not have workplace pharmaceutical coverage, or maybe you do, but your coverage sucks and you can't afford the copay or what have you, or you only get so many dollars a year and you've already expended all your prescription coverage dollars, or any one of those reasons. You can't afford that medicine, so you don't take it, or you only take a half dose and you get sick and you end up in hospital, or you end up with a chronic illness that over your life lowers your productivity. You have to go on disability, and you can see how over millions of people, this has major economic effects. And dental's another big one. I mean, Dental's the sort of thing where if you brush and you floss, but importantly, if you can get your routine checkups and cleanings, those minor cavities don't become major cavities, and those major cavities don't become tooth infections, because tooth infections don't just affect your mouth. They affect your lymph nodes. They can cause heart attacks amongst some people. They can cause all sorts of illnesses, which again will land you in hospital, and it's going to be very expensive. So I do think that we have to talk about the spin-off effects of social programs. And a lot of people have talked about how, for instance, childcare means that a greater proportion of people, specifically women, can be involved in the formal wage economy, which, can address things that, whether it's the need for workers and some times when the economy is hot and there's low unemployment, or just, the fact that these people are contributing, child rearing and home, like domestic labor is real labor, but they're contributing to the formal wage economy in the way they weren't. And that's a good thing as well, because as it is right now, there is some 2-child couples where, you have a woman or a man who's very well educated, could be earning good money, but realizes that if childcare is $40,000 a year for their multiple children, and they make even say 50 or 60, it might just not be worth it. They'll just rather stay home and feel like they should just stay home. And that's removing a productive person from the economy. Now, on the question of Indigenous people, why are they treated so poorly? The biggest factor is Canada's founded, and it still is, in a sense, a white supremacist society. And we've just never really put our political and financial and logistical will and might behind actually solving the issue. That's the biggest factor. Indigenous people suffer because Canadians have not cared. That's the biggest factor. There are other factors as well. Other factors include, historic racism, which has left Indigenous people with deep intergenerational traumas within their communities that makes it very difficult. Many Indigenous communities are very isolated, not by design. There are certain Indigenous communities that, for millennia have lived in the far north, like the Inuit. But there are some Indigenous communities that used to be semi-nomadic or nomadic, depending on the culture and the time and the region. And they were effectively, removed from their ability to roam freely by the settler Canadian state in the 1800s mostly, and often put on reserves in isolated areas, and put on reserves where their traditional hunting and fishing and farming systems could not work, because the land was bad or the climate was slightly different, or in some cases rather largely different. And so we've set up these situations in some ways where Indigenous people were fundamentally unable to sustain themselves, not because of inferiorities, but because of a deliberate system to deprive them of the best land, so that land could go to European settlers or go to railway companies or to big landowners or what have you. In other cases, even our civic development has affected them. The Winnipeg in the early 1900s was Canada's third biggest city and grew extremely fast. And basically everyone got sick because there was no water filtration. So the entire poor part of town basically got like cholera, and there was tuberculosis and major illnesses. And what happened was they built an aqueduct system. They built a water system from Shoal Lake, which was an Indigenous community relatively close to Winnipeg. And they took the water from that Indigenous community, and it made Winnipeg a livable city. But in the process, it flooded part of the Indigenous people's land and actually split their reserve in half, meaning that the people became disconnected from one another. And it's an example of how the expansion of Canadian cities, even as it benefited working class and regular people in those cities, was on the backs of Indigenous people. And again, because, and there are exceptions, of course, in some big cities, especially in the West, there are a lot of Indigenous people who live in cities. The reality is that Indigenous people sometimes are more in the country, and out of sight, out of mind in some people's perception, means that people are less willing to work with Indigenous people to solve those issues. And other factors include just historic systems of genocide in some ways, because you're talking about, for instance, the residential school system where children were taken away from their families and made to not speak their language and practice their traditional practices and all of these sorts of things. And until the 1960s, Indigenous people, if they wanted the right to vote, they had to renounce their status as quote unquote Indians. And when I use that term, I mean it in the legal sense. And even hospital systems used to be segregated. And so a lot of Indigenous communities were absolutely racked by tuberculosis and other forms of contagious illnesses in the 1900s that white Canadians were not. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why this still is the case. And some people have argued in some ways that Canada is more of a racist society than the United States, given how badly we've treated our Indigenous people. Of course, I don't know. Some people might disagree with that.
Okay, Matthew Daniels says, last stream you mentioned you were thinking about interviews. Do you have any names you can drop of who you'd like to speak with most?
I mean, yeah. I mean, if I could speak to some people, I'd love to speak to some of the people that I've been following on social media for a while. I'd love to speak, for instance, especially the people who have, in general, this is maybe not a name. I'll name some politicians. You know, I'd love to talk to Sven Robinson, maybe Nikki Ashton, talk to NDPers on the left, maybe Matthew Green. I haven't confirmed with any of these people. I haven't even discussed it with any of these people, so don't think that they're coming on. But these are some people I'd really like to talk to. I'd love to talk to some people who I know and have good left politics, but bring, you know, a diverse perspective that I don't necessarily. I mean, white guy talks on the internet is not a new thing, and so I want to bring those perspectives. So, for instance, for me, talking about Indigenous issues is very difficult because I'm not an expert on Indigenous issues in politics and culture and history. And I'm wary of making mistakes and of misrepresenting things and of not using the correct terminology, not in the sense that people will cancel me or anything. I'm not worried about political correctness attacking me, but I want to do people justice. So if I could speak to people from the Indigenous community, if I could speak to people from the LGBTQ2S community, these would be things that I think would be very interesting. And I would give space to topics that I don't talk about a lot on this channel for a variety of reasons. And I would like to bring those perspectives. So a mixture of politicians I would love to talk to, but also some folks that in a general sense bring these unique perspectives. And I have some folks in mind that I would talk to, but that's something I'm still working on. I might do a couple test interviews with some friends. Maybe Brianna and I will do a test interview just to see if the recording software that I can use works, and then I can sort of maybe do a test run, get it ready for editing. And if I can sort of do that more or less, maybe I'll feel more comfortable doing an interview. Because right now I've gotten streaming down a little bit. I've gotten, making an actual plain video, but an interview process is a different technical process, slightly at least. So I want to get that done right before I start asking people to give me their hard-earned time and whatnot.
James Harris asks, what Canadian-based education can you point to with regard to starting worker cooperatives, other hidden resources out there?
I mean, in terms of education, I mean, I think, history is a good one. I mean, I think in terms of like reading the history of cooperatives in this country is very important. You can see where they've gone, where they've done well, what they've done wrong. You can look at famous historical examples. Some you could look at existing cooperatives and how they operate. You could look at even things like credit unions, see what they do and what they do right and wrong. Because there are some cooperatives that in a sense are cooperative, but they still rely on a kind of non-owner worker-based thing, which is why the cooperative in Saskatchewan, was it Saskatchewan? I know it was out west. Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. Went on strike, and effectively the workers were striking against the cooperative ownership. So there's different cooperative models as well. In general, I do support increased worker ownership of industry. I've argued that I don't think that the biggest industry should be owned by individual groups of workers. I think that could create situations where you effectively recreate a class structure in a socialist society. Like, for instance, if the power workers individually as a group own the power structure, that gives them much more power than, let's say, people who own service-based industries. And so you create a class structure of which Soviet, if you will, directly controls the means of energy and communication. I do think like the biggest, most monopolistic industry should be owned directly by governments, be they provincial or federal or municipal. But worker ownership is 100% part of any socialist vision. And even things that get us on the path there, whether it's worker councils, whether it's unions demanding, in addition to better wages and conditions, maybe the union demanding a percentage of shares in the company to be administered by the union, maybe union elected or worker elected seats on the board. These are all things that the NDP has talked about historically. It's not really something in our main platform right now, which I say is disappointing, but the platform is very ambitious already. So I think that they want to go to Canadians with a streamlined vision, and I totally get that. But I do think we need to talk more about public and cooperative and worker ownership, because I do think that those are how you start to challenge capitalism. Because again, Tommy Douglas would make this argument in the 70s, and Ed Broadbent and David Lewis would, when they all led the NDP in that general period. And they all basically said that social programs are part of socialism, but they're not the ends of socialism. Social programs are a factor in a socialist society, but a socialist society requires economic democracy. And economic democracy, in my view, has to include, workers having a direct say in the management of their workplace. And the specifics of that we can hammer out, but that's my general belief.
Some guy from Vancouver says, does the NDP's platform outdo Bernie's Medicaid for All platform?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think they're similar in some ways, and I think they've sort of pushed one another. There's a video back in the 80s or early 90s or something where Bernie spoke about how the NDP was something that he wanted to see in the United States, that at that point he was maybe still in the mindset that you needed a third party. I think he's more moved in the mindset that the Democrats can be taken over. And I think he's got a long way to go on that one. I don't think it'll happen very quickly, but you do see the elements of democratic socialists and of real progressives running and winning primaries and really causing a fear in the hearts of Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. And that's great to see. But Bernie, I think, was inspired by the NDP and saw what Tommy Douglas did and felt it could be replicated in Canada. When he came to Canada, he acknowledged that, Canada is an inspiration to him. But even Bernie said to us when he came to Canada to speak about healthcare, he said, well, I recognize that here in Canada too, you guys have a lot more, you guys have a better system than we do, but you guys need dental. You guys need all these sorts of things that we don't have, that we also don't have. And I think in that sense, I think Jagmeet's plan is probably in a similar ballpark, but I think it's maybe a bit more achievable, because I think Bernie might end up in a situation much like Tommy Douglas, where Tommy Douglas didn't necessarily want to have optical and dental and pharmaceutical and mental health care all excluded or quasi-excluded. But, the NDP won what it could and did what it could and sort of had to deal with that. And nowadays, I think we're right to push for something greater. So to me, it's less, is Bernie's plan better on Medicaid for all or Medicare for all versus Jagmeet Singh's head-to-toe healthcare plan? I think it's important that the left in general is not playing defense anymore. For a long time, basically from the mid-'80s until really a few years ago, the left was playing defense. It was stop privatization. It was protect public services. And now, whether we're going far enough is another debate. You had Andrea Horwath in 2018 run on renationalizing hydro. You had Andrea Horwath running on creating dental care and pharmacare and childcare. And so I think that as long as the left in Canada is playing offense, we're on the right path, even though we can have specific debates about, are we moving fast enough, or are we prioritizing certain issues correctly, or what have you?
Leakham9 says you've put a lot of promotion behind the NDP. Do you think do you think they are really a way forward and not captured by the system like the rest of the parties? Are you a reform towards revolution guy?
Yeah, I mean, my view is that, I don't know if a revolution would work in Canada. I don't know if Canadians would support it. Revolution happened in other countries, like Cuba, and Cuba's better off for it. I know a lot of people, maybe that's controversial, but Fidel system was better than Cuba was, and it's a better society than many of the U.S.-sphered Central American states. Revolution, I guess, could work in some cases. I just don't think it's going to work in Canada. I don't know if it's the path forward. In my view, the democratic way is the path forward. And I do think the NDP is fundamentally the only major party in English Canada right now that has that sort of vision within itself. And the leadership, I have to say, if I'm being fully honest, isn't there yet. But there's large swaths of the membership that are. And even if they're not there yet, it's important to work within it. A lot of my fellow socialists will say to me, why do you work within the NDP? They're a reformist institution that's not pushing for the end of capitalist society. You're just wasting your time. And you know what I tell them? And they're almost always people who support the labor movement. Which unions in Canada are calling for the end of social capitalism? Which unions are pushing for more than reformism right now? For being honest. And the answer is very few, if any. And yet we still recognize that the labor movement has a fundamental role to play, even if the labor movement is flawed and ultimately reformist. And so I say the NDP is a lot like a trade union right now in Canada. They are the force with the potential to build socialism, even if currently they're not building socialism. And so that's my general perspective. Now, of course, in Quebec, there's also Quebec Solidaire. So, I mean, that would be, if for instance, I was to vote for a political party that wasn't the NDP right now in this country, I would likely vote for Quebec Solidaire in Quebec right now over the Quebec NDP provincially, not only because the Quebec NDP was largely inexistent, but because I feel in effect barring the issue of sovereignty, which is important, but I don't think is so important that I vote. I weigh everything on it. Quebec Solidaire offers, what was in effect the sort of NDP vision in Quebec. They even use orange as their color, which I don't think is a coincidence, right? So, I mean, that's my vision. The NDP, for all of its flaws, is the historical and future party of socialism in the country. People will disagree with me with that, but that's my perspective. And that's why I feel comfortable working within its structures.
Okay, Tornado Nick wants your thoughts on Sino-Canadian relations and the future for that. And he thinks that further cooperation and trade with China is an important future avenue for a progressive Canada.
Yeah, I mean, with China's very interesting. I mean, I think you can't ignore China. And this was Pierre Trudeau's point for a long time, and he got attacked for it, was like, look, you can't ignore China. It's at the time it was a quarter of the world's population. Now it's more like a fifth or a sixth. But in any sense, like 1 in 5 or 6 people is Chinese. And the reality is you can't operate in a world without China. And I totally agree that you need to have that relationship. Now, there are major questions, however. I mean, right now, I have concerns with China's approach to human rights and labor laws, and I'm concerned about how, trade with China without a greater stand to recognize the rights of workers in that country offers some pitfalls. So in general, I'm supportive of the idea that you can't isolate China. You likely have to operate with the reality of a Chinese government that is not only a superpower now, or a power now, but is almost inevitably going to become the second superpower to the U.S. The U.S. has been the undisputed superpower since the end of the Soviet Union, and I think China will become the second superpower if it's not there already. And I think you have to operate within that world. And Canada's going to be an interesting position there because, we're so closely tied to the US and we're so closely tied in some ways to Europe. And, the EU sort of being collectively a superpower of its own. Where was Canada's future going to lie? And I think there's going to be a real interesting debate. And it's in moments like we're in right now where, the U.S., there's the extradition case with the Huawei CEO, and Canada, in a sense, is in between these two powers fighting over this case that's seemingly about one woman, but that's affecting economic issues, and it's affecting human rights issues, and it's affecting diplomatic issues. So, I mean, I do think that China can't be ignored, but I wish that we could operate with a China that had better respect for human rights and for labor rights, because right now I don't see that, and I worry about that undercutting the labor rights of Canadians, for instance, and China being so massive, it has that effect to shift policy, and I'm concerned about that. But I'm not an anti-Chinese isolationist in that sense.
Laura was here, says, what do you think about abolishing political parties altogether, like what the Northwest Territories did?
I think that, like in Ontario at the municipal level, we don't have parties, although sort of quasi-parties form in city councils. I know in BC, municipally, you guys have parties, but in Ontario, we don't. I think it works okay on a smaller scale, but I don't know, and I know the Northwest Territories isn't a small scale, but it's a small population. I think it can work at those levels and be okay, but I worry about a whole large province or a whole country being run like that, because I feel like the voters would probably lose some sense of accountability. And while you might lose the blackmail of parties strong-arming politicians, you're going to increase bribery. I really feel like that. It's going to be easier to buy politicians under that system. Look at the US model. The US has a strict party system like Canada, but the party discipline is much weaker. Pretty much everyone in the Congress is a Republican or a Democrat, but they don't always vote in the party structure. So what that means is a capitalist doesn't have to buy a whole party. They just have to buy half a dozen Congress people or senators in the right states for the right time, for the right money, to effectively stop any kind of reform or to create reform they desire. And I'm concerned about a total lack of a party really creating that system. I also think it'll make it difficult for Canadians to understand things. It'll make it difficult also for Canadians to really understand how governments will be formed. So, for instance, if we operate under the assumption that we keep the Westminster system, but we don't have parties, we elect our 338 MPs, and then from there on, they will elect the Prime Minister and they will elect the entire cabinet. How do you get any sort of sense for the general trajectory of that government? Currently, we know, like, the Liberals and Doug Ford's Conservatives here, they won and then they lied to voters. But in a general sense, they had to present a platform. They had to present a vision of some kind. And voters at least had some information, both about who their local guy or gal was, but also about the broad party. I'm very worried that with 338 people, that it's going to become an extremely difficult system for any transparency or any predictability of the result. In effect, you'll have no way of knowing. So, I mean, I see issues with the party system, and that's why, for me, I support proportional representation, but only the open list model, where the parties don't get to choose the rankings of the people on their proportional list. The voters themselves choose that on their ballot. But ultimately, I don't see an alternative to some kind of party model at the federal level right now. Maybe in the future, we'll have some kind of decentralized democracy where everybody can vote on every issue. Even that has some Black Mirror-like horrors that I can think of. But to me right now, I think you do need some kind of party system with any kind of scale. But again, municipally and in the territories, maybe PEI one day, maybe PEI could be a non-party province, given how small it is and relatively homogenous it is. But beyond that, I don't think it would work, just personally.
Amir wants to know if you have any opinion on the job market for academia in social science / politics.
It's bad. It's really bad. It's bad. If I'm being 100%, it's bad. I'm going to be honest. I mean, I don't see an academic job for myself, and I'm not bragging or anything, but I was a grad student who did everything right. I won a Tri-Council, basically a Shirk Award. It's basically a government-funded award at the master's level, and I won it at the PhD level. And I'm on a Shirk postdoc right now that's sort of on ending up in a few months, and I won that. I've won heavy graduate funding, the big awards at every level. I finished in almost 5 years, so right on time on a PhD. I wasn't one of, they don't like when you take 8 years. I published a couple articles while I was in grad school. My book came out within 3 years of graduation, which is fast. In addition to all of that, I did, media work and wrote for popular sources showing that I'm interested in public engagement, which is something that funding agencies and schools like to see. And despite all that, I mean, I've interviewed for one tenure track job and a few semi-permanent positions. So most of the jobs I've applied for, I haven't interviewed yet. The system is incredibly competitive. There's not a lot of jobs right now. And so it's very bad. And one of the challenges is that it's also a lot of luck-based things. So for instance, they might hire at all the Canadian universities, say next year, they might have 3 or 4 jobs in Canadian history. but it's, it's like, okay, so this school wants to hire somebody who focuses on the 1800s. Well, that's not me. I do 1900s history. So it's like that. So I can't apply to that one. Or this one, they focus on somebody who does indigenous history. And 100% legitimately, our schools do not have enough indigenous historians, like people who are indigenous or people who study indigenous history. So they want to fill that historical gap. But I'm neither indigenous nor do I do indigenous history. So that job's not really open to me. And then another job might want somebody who does diplomatic history. Again, I don't really do diplomatic history. And then finally, there may be a job who wants somebody who does labor or working class history. But then beyond all of this, you're competing with everybody else. Because the job market is so bad, you're not just competing with people who have graduated recently around the same time you are. You're competing with new graduates and people in some cases who have been waiting for jobs for years before you. So the system is very bad and jobs are very scarce. That's at least history. Some social sciences are better off. Labor studies right now has had a good amount of hiring. But again, with labor studies and a lot of interdisciplinary programs, luck is even more important because it's not just, do they want you? It's like, are you a sociologist? Because this time they really want a sociologist. But next time they might want an economist. This time they want a historian. But the time after that, they might want somebody who studies international development and labor. And so the academic job market is utterly broken, at least in history, and many of the social sciences and humanities. And there's no way of sugarcoating it. I mean, the PhD was still a good decision. I had a lot of fun doing it. I was able to pay off my student loans during the course of my PhD because of the funding I had. I built a lot of my media profile connections. Yeah. Yes, and my wife had a good job. I have a sugar mama, basically. And so all of these sorts of things were good. I would do it all again. I would. As strange as it sounds right now, but only because during the PhD, I did a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't the PhD. I wrote for the Globe and Mail and the Washington Post and Maclean's. I was on the bargaining unit and I was a grievance officer for my local union. I was the young worker representative for my union in Ontario. I went to OFL and CLC conventions and did all of those sorts of things. So if you're going to do it to get a tenure track job, it'll likely end in disappointment. But if you treat the PhD as a 5-year window in which to build your profile as a public intellectual and maybe do things like this, there are worse things to do. There are worse things. Yeah.
Okay, some guy from Vancouver asks, what are some of the toxic elements of unions and how do we combat and destigmatize unions? Combat them, the toxic elements, and destigmatize unions.
Yeah. So some unions, depending on the union, some unions still have issues with equity. Some unions, especially male-dominated unions, still have forms of toxic masculinity within the membership and within certain elements of the leadership. The ways certain things are talked about are troubling, and that's just a matter of education. Certain unions are, I think, toxic in a sense that that there's still a lot of intergenerational struggle. And so I think one of the big toxic elements right now is things like 2-tier contracts. That's a real toxic element. Some unions have failed to represent young workers. Some unions have fought. Brianna is a member of the United Steelworkers. They went on like a 2-year strike at a company to fight against a contract that would basically mean that all new hires would not have a pension and would make $5 an hour less than the older guys. And they fought that and they lost, but they fought valiantly. Some other unions, I won't name names here, have basically signed away the next generation, and the membership just took their wage increase, saved their own pensions, and said F you to the new guys, all the new guys coming in. So anybody hired after the date of the contract signing didn't have a pension or had a defined contributions instead of a defined benefits pension. To me, that's one of the most toxic things in our movement because it divides solidarity, and it basically means that the next generation of workers is being sold out. And I think that's a major factor. There's also still some toxicity from time to time when nativism creeps in. Unifor, for instance, some good activists in Unifor, a lot of rank and file people really fought and said when GM was closing, their response was nationalize GM. And there was a lot of discourse from some elements of Unifor to do that. But other parts of Unifor, including the leadership, basically made it into an anti-Mexico campaign. Basically saying that, you're shipping Canadian jobs off to Mexico and the Mexicans are stealing our jobs. And maybe that was effective for getting support from some parts of the population, but I didn't like it. And they're blaming Mexico, and they didn't do nearly enough blaming of the right to work states, who I think in some ways are more to blame, because at the very least, I can be sympathetic to Mexico's plight as a historically colonialized nation and beaten down nation for wanting to do what it can to get jobs, despite the fact that it might not be great for Canada. But I have no sympathy for, Alabama basically voting away good jobs for itself and screwing over the northern good states and screwing over Canada. And so they made it all about Mexico, and that was really ugly. And in terms of destigmatizing unions, I think it's the big thing we have to do is make a better connection between the things unions do and the fact that unions do them. And Brianna knows this better than I do. But this actually applies to the NDP too, ironically as it is. You poll people on what unions do and want to do, and they like it. And then you say, do you support unions? They'd be like, nah. So it's like, do you want fair wages at work? Yeah. Do you want good vacation time? Yeah. Do you want like a transparent process of who gets hired and fired and who gets promoted and whatnot? They'd be like, yeah. Do you want, a clear sense of how discipline is done in the workplace and how discipline is done? Yeah. It's like, okay, well, do you want a union? Because a union will be the only force that does any or all of those things. You'd be like, nah. And so I think unions need to do a better job at selling that vision to people. And I think that's something that needs to happen. But there are toxic elements of unions in that sense that need to become better at becoming inclusive. And unions in general are only now really starting to organize effectively in non-white Canadian communities. For a long time, we didn't have a lot of people of color in leadership in our unions or even in staff positions in our unions of influence. And so reaching out to non-English speaking communities especially was very difficult. And so there was a perception from certain ethnocultural communities that the union movement was a white movement and largely excluded them. And now that we're working on fixing that, which was a toxic element, was that the union leadership is old and it's white. It's not necessarily representative of the membership. Women's equality in unions is I think in a better position than generational and racial equality, although even that's not as to the point of where it should be. But that's another factor is bringing diversity into the actual union structures, not just out of a sense that diversity is good, but just out of the sense that you go into a lot of these ethnocultural communities. And, the companies in these communities exploit their workers, and they sort of get away with it because there's this bond of ethnic solidarity between the capitalist and the worker. But, if you bring in workers with that same ethnocultural background, you can find success. And this isn't new. Canada did this. Some unions that were very successful in the 20s and 30s and 40s were successful because they hired Italians and Jews and Poles and Finns and Ukrainians to organize Italians and Jews and Poles and Finns and Ukrainians, because they trusted one another and they spoke one another's languages and they went to the same churches, ate the same food. And so we need to do those same things, and we lagged behind on that.
Okay, so the question here from Datarev: unions and environmentalism doesn't usually go hand in hand too well. Would you like to comment?
Well, that's an interesting point. That's the perception. And there are certainly some unions and some environmentalist groups that don't get along with one another. There are some unions that are development at all costs. They'll support conservative parties, like Liuna, for instance, that was a big backer of Doug Ford. I don't know if they have any room to work with environmentalists. And there are a lot of environmentalists, especially ones that are driven by elite politics, that don't really care about working class people in their communities. And maybe that environmentalism to them is largely keeping their beach line clean, but it's not actually about fundamentally building economic justice and climate justice and fighting environmental racism. But I don't know if they're disconnected. I've done a little bit of research on this, and John Henry Hatter, I think it is, he's a scholar out west, has done some research on the ways in which unions and environmentalists can work well together. And actually one historic example, and it still plays out today, is one of the big booms of environmentalist understanding in Canada and the USA came not from the environmentalist movement, from health and safety activists within unionized workplaces. That health and safety activists were finding out that companies were dumping poisonous chemicals into the water, and they were not making the workplace safe from these chemicals. And so they connected, not getting sick to the water supply being poisoned, which would make them sick and their children sick and their community sick. And in a sense, that community activism around fighting pollution and those sorts of things was melded in some way with environmentalism, not always fully successfully, and not always in a sense that there was a formal alliance between environmentalist movements and workers' movements, but in a general sense that there was something to be had there. And I mean, I think that we still need to do a lot more. And I think that's why the Green New Deal, at least potentially, is this potentially revolutionary approach, because it's going to say to people, it's not jobs or the environment, it's jobs and the environment. And that you can decarbonize the economy and build an economy that works for the 99% and works for the people who are going to be displaced by the carbon industry. And it's not going to be perfect. I'm under no illusion. And the reality is that there's going to be some people who are working class people right now who work in the oil industry and make a level of income that we cannot replicate maybe in other industries, but we can promise them a decent level of income, and we can promise them that your children will not die in a fiery hellscape 2 generations from now, or your grandchildren won't. And maybe that's worth losing the oil industry. I don't know if we're going to be able to sell that to everyone, but I hope we can sell that to enough of the broad working people that we can build a new movement that includes the environment and workers. So we have to do a better job, but there are historic examples. And again, health and safety activism is connected and has been connected and still is and will be connected to environmentalist causes, 100%. Because if workers can say poor environmental conditions affect us and the community, and we're making it a bargaining issue because we want a safe workplace, in effect, environmentalism and trade unionism is linked there.
Okay, Lee Kim Nines says that they would love to see unions wake up to class consciousness again. And Comrade Internet says it would be nice if our unions could coordinate with their Mexican comrades. I think those questions kind of go together.
Yeah, I think, well, first on the Mexican comrades, there are some examples. Again, Brianna knows more. I think Brianna, honestly, I don't know, you guys could go on. I think Brianna needs to make some YouTube videos at some point to talk about what she knows, because Brianna is a member of the Steelworkers, and the Steelworkers, I don't know, how long has this been going on? Is it a relatively for a long time now, at least a decade or two? The United Steelworkers in both Canada and the USA have formed an alliance with miners in Mexico, the Los Mineros, and they basically formed an alliance with them to work with those miners to improve their conditions, both out of a sense that we're all together in this North American alliance, that because of NAFTA, capital is united in Canada, Mexico, and the USA. So why not workers? And you maybe selfishly, but if you raise the standards of workers in Mexico, you de-incentivize, or at least partially de-incentivize, the need to outsource to Mexico. So if you improve the standards there, it makes it harder for capital to hold the dagger over you that we're going to move to Mexico if Mexico's wages keep getting better and better and better. And I think that's an important aspect. So I'm under no illusion that the Los Mineros are all that's needed, but there are some examples, and maybe in the auto sector, maybe they can learn from the United Steelworkers and find examples there of building those alliances with workers. And because I think it's a major factor. So what was the other?
Lee Kim Nines would love to see unions wake up to class consciousness again. If you could comment on that. Yeah,
I mean, I agree. I think that a lot of unions are actually they're very concerned, and right now it's like the NDP's to the left of most unions. Most unions right now, I'm telling you, it's going to be disappointing. There's a lot of unions lining up for Justin Trudeau. They haven't said it yet. I'm very concerned. There's going to be a lot of ABC unions, and they're going to support Trudeau, even though the NDP is going to run on everything the labor movement supports and all of those things. I am concerned with certain aspects of the labor movement. There are good unions, CUPE, the Steelworkers, they're with the NDP, they're pushing for stuff. But then there are some other unions that are going to be, running a defensive campaign to stop Andrew Scheer, and we're not going to win anything from that. But I think one positive thing you're seeing from the labor movement, at least from rank and file trade unionists, is they're realizing that there's more to unions than just collective bargaining and grievances. And one thing I've noted as a historian is that that's what made the Winnipeg General Strike special, was that the Winnipeg General Strike at its peak had more non-union workers off the job than union workers, because the majority back then, Canada's union density was lower than 15%. Most workers weren't in a union back then, even less than today, which is like 30% now. And so they got non-unionized workers to go out on strike because they believed in the broader working class struggle. And what I can say right now is that in the last 10 years or so, there's been more campaigns by unions to fight for workers that aren't in unions, whether it's pushing for labor legislation to, say, fight for the rights of workers that work for subcontracting companies. Those workers are very difficult to unionize, but if you improve labor law, you help them. And the biggest example is the Fight for 15. And whether it's worked everywhere, the Fight for 15 is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily for the benefit of non-unionized workers. And unions have funded that organization to some degree, and they've offered staff support. And a lot, not everybody, but a lot of the volunteers on those campaigns are members of unions. And so they're trying to make this the case that whether you're in a union or not, you're still part of the working class, and that we need to fight with that reality. So I don't think it's the end of it, and I think you're right, we need to do more. But the Fight for 15 is an example of how you can build a campaign in which unions play a role, but it's actually not, at the end of the day, really about unionized workers or collective bargaining. Because again, most unionized workers in Canada make more than $15 an hour. Most do. Not everybody. There are some unionized workers that don't make $15 an hour, but many of them do. And so it's primarily for the benefit of non-unionized minimum wage and low wage workers. And I think that's an example. You decouple to a certain degree the project of unions from the project of collective bargaining. I don't want to say collective bargaining is not important, but when you start doing that, you recognize the class struggle a little bit more vividly. I think that's my perspective.
I don't really see any more questions popping up.
Okay, well, I mean, we're almost at about 10 o'clock right now. So we'll probably start to wrap it up. If people have any last minute questions, we'll just get them out now. We'll answer them, but we'll wrap up. Any comments, questions about the channel, things like that, broader questions that people want to talk about, happy to field them for the next few minutes.
Matthew Daniels gave a donation. He
said
yes. He had to go, but he says thank you.
Yeah, and thank you guys for the super chat donations. I really appreciate that. Again, I know not everyone has the desire or the ability to do those things, but they're very helpful. They help to produce more content on the channel, and with that money, you invest in the quality and quantity of content on the channel. And it's a nice token of appreciation. It's like a video game. It makes you feel good. It's like I see those numbers popping up. So I very much enjoy that. And so if you have the ability, please consider doing that. I really appreciate those donations.
Amir wants to know how often we might do live streams.
Somebody asked how you do super chats. I believe here on the thing, there's a little monetary thing you can click. I think it's next to your little emoji. I believe it's there. You might not be able to do it on mobile. I don't know if you can do it on mobile. That's something you can look at. But you can click that sign and you can make a donation. I don't know if you have to credit card or PayPal. I'm not sure, but that's something you can certainly do to give super chats. Sorry, say that again, for me.
Amir wants to know how often we'll do live stream.
So as you guys know, with my Patreon, and many of you, I've seen some of you, I don't. Who have commented and whatnot are Patreon supporters, and I very much appreciate your support on Patreon. And one of the factors with Patreon is that I have some stretch goals. So when you give me money on Patreon, depending on the level of support, I offer certain things. So at $1, I put your name on the credits of my videos at the end of them. At $5, you get that plus a note. At $10, you get the note, the credits, and I give you I have a special Slack chat where I talk with my supporters there, and they share news stories with me. We can have chats whenever we're both available, for the people in that group. And then for $25, you can basically tell me a video and a topic, and within reason, if you want me to make a video about why capitalism is awesome, I'm not going to do it. But if you tell me if you want to have a video on something, I will make a video. And then at $50, I know that's a lot of money, I will give you a free physical copy of my book, which retails for $35 with a signed copy. Of course, no one's donated at those two higher levels. I actually don't know if I expect people to, but they are there. But there's also stretch goals, like a collective thing. So for the first $100, when I got to 100, my goal was to set up to do at least one live stream a month. And I did that first official live stream about 2 weeks ago. And it went really well. There were about 40 people this time. This time, I think we peaked more at 30, but there was really good, consistent engagement. So I'm very happy. So I've decided that I want to do these every 2 weeks. I'll likely keep them on Wednesdays at about 8 p.m. Eastern and do them for about an hour and a half, 2 hours, depending on the how much steam I have and how much steam you guys have. But I also might do streams for other events. For example, I did a stream before my first like Patreon funded one. I did one on the Democratic Party debates. I sort of just hopped on after watching the debates, and we just chatted with anybody who happened to be online. I might do streams like that. They'll be more informal. Brianna might not be here to read questions, but I will offer those streams, and they won't count as part of the once every 2 weeks. Now, if they continue to be successful, people, of course, people are giving me super chat money, and they continue to have really good engagement with my supporters, I could see myself doing them weekly. And also, as we get closer to the election, both the Canadian election, but also when the American election really starts to go into hyperdrive early in 2020, 2020. I always mix up years. Yeah, 2020. I will probably move towards a weekly model in those times, because there'll be a greater interest from my viewers and just non-subscribers who are not right now to hear about Canadian politics. So I think bi-weekly most of the time, with the occasional additional stream for big events like debates and what have you.
Some guy from Vancouver wants you to do a capitalism is awesome satirical video.
I mean, some people have suggested some things. I don't know what you guys think. Like, if I could be funny, but I'm not funny. I don't know. I try to tell jokes sometimes in my video and they don't work. I'm not a funny guy. Brianna doesn't laugh at most of my jokes.
She's really not funny.
Yeah, my students don't laugh at most of my jokes. Again, they laugh at sometimes. I think it's out of pity, or I wear them down, like over the term. But some people have suggested I do some funnier stuff, but I'm worried about coming off, not funny or coming off as non-satirical. One thing that one of my friends suggested, I don't know if he was here tonight, Brandon. I don't know if he was on the chat, but one of my real life friends who watches my channel suggests that I get a lot of hate both from liberals and from like the far right, both on YouTube and Twitter. And so I should do like a fan mail where I just read my hate mail and make fun of that the hate mail. But I don't know if I can do that without coming off as bitter. So these are things that I have to consider. But I haven't made a commitment to yet. I don't know if I have that style, that kind of ability to be almost like an actor, like someone like ContraPoints like does acting in her videos. And H-Bomb, when he like took the axe to knock down the wall. I mean, these are things that I don't know. Even if my channel becomes huge like theirs someday, I don't. Maybe it will, but I don't know if it'll ever be me being like performative in that same sense. I don't know if I have that in me.
People might think you're actually eating Irish babies.
People might actually think I'm eating Irish babies. Yes.
Okay, I think that's all our questions.
All right, so guys, I hope you have a good one. I'm gonna head out for tonight. But like always, you'll see 1 or 2 videos a day from me until the next stream. Again, 2 weeks from now, I'll be doing another stream. If for whatever reason, that Wednesday doesn't work in particular for me, I'll give you guys as much notice as possible and shift it to another day that week. But for the foreseeable future, every second Wednesday will be kind of stream night. And if I'm on at another time, there might not be any notice, but of course because I'll be kind of hopping on. Maybe what I'll try actually is these I think are easier to monetize, because YouTube is competing with Twitch on streaming. And so YouTube actually has competition with the stream game. So maybe with some political issues, maybe I'll hop on to live stream during the day, do a stream, and then people can watch the video after. So they'll be more unpolished than my current videos, but maybe that's a way to get you guys news quickly and offer something that you guys can consume. And if you happen to be around during the stream, we could talk about those things. But that's something I'm just toying with as I kind of muse right now. So I will I will see you guys next time. If you guys have any more comments or concerns, you can of course leave them, because this will go up as a traditional video shortly after we end. And then once that happens, you guys can leave comments in that section, and I'll be sure to see them and be able to respond to those. So everyone have a good one. Okay. Bye, guys.